Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Projects at Work webinar, The Business Case for Better Software Practices. My name's Andy Jordan and I'll be moderating the session today, and I'm delighted to be joined by Steve McConnell, who will be presenting. Before I introduce Steve, just a couple of little housekeeping items for everyone. We will have some time at the end of the session for some Q&A, so if you do have some questions as we go along, please feel free to ask those. You should have in your GoToWebinar console a little chat box, and if you type your question into that chat, then we will be able to get to as many questions as possible afterwards. This session is being recorded, and we will be making copies of the recording available to everybody after the presentation. So you should be able to get an email with that information after today's call. So, without any further ado, let me introduce to you Steve McConnell. Steve is a renowned thought leader on software development best practices. He's the author of several best-selling books, including the highly influential Code Complete, which is often cited as the most popular software development book of all time. Steve's books have sold more than 1 million copies overall, and they've been translated into 20 languages. Steve founded Construx in 1996 to help companies apply proven best practices to their software development. In his role as CEO and Chief Software Engineer at Construx, Steve teaches classes, writes books and articles, and oversees software engineering practices. Steve, thank you so much for making time for us again today, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Andy. Today we're going to take a little bit of a different tack for people who have listened to some of my other talks that are more technical in nature. This one really is a little bit more business-oriented. We often will talk about the motivation for better software practices really based on technical parameters or maybe first-level project parameters. Today I want to pop up a level and talk about the motivation for better software practices really at the business level. And at this level, I think we can be concerned with questions that you may not really be aware of at a detailed technical level, but that I think are quite important for businesses to be able to answer. And so here are 7 tough business questions. You should ask yourself, can my business answer these questions? Number 1, what % of your projects are on time and on budget? We find a surprisingly small number of businesses that actually track that at the portfolio level. Like, the businesses cannot even answer what percentage of their projects are on time and on budget. The second question, how does your productivity compare to similar organizations? Again, I think very few businesses can answer that. Beyond that, I think very few businesses would even really quite understand what the importance of that is or how to frame the question or why it might matter to them exactly. Third question, is your productivity improving? How much is it improving? Again, a difficult question for most businesses to answer, and a big part of that is most businesses really don't have much of an idea of how they would even measure their productivity, and that's a fairly thorny question. Fourth question, what percentage of your costs arise from reactive, unplanned work? We see that the typical project incurs more than half its cost from unplanned defect correction work. And how does that relate to your organization? Certainly if you're in that average case of incurring more than half your cost from unplanned defect correction work, you would want to know that. Question number 5, what is the real return on investment or ROI of your offshore operations? We've seen many organizations move to offshore staffing models over the last 10 or 15 years. Many of those are motivated by a desire to save costs. And yet many organizations really don't track the full cost, all things considered, of those offshore operations. Sixth question, what is the real ROI of your Agile implementation? We've seen many organizations embrace Agile over the last 10 years, some better and some worse. What benefit are you really getting from that? And the seventh question, what will you do next year to improve performance? Do you have a specific plan that will give you some reason to believe that your performance next year will be better than your performance this year? And I think in many businesses, the main plan, sad to say, is wishful thinking, and of course that's not a very effective plan. So in order to talk about the business case for better software practices, I think first we have to talk briefly about the state of the practice. some of this may be familiar to some of you, some of it may not. We have in the software industry on the order of half the projects are delivered more or less successfully. So delivered with more or less on time, more or less on budget, and more or less with expected functionality. However, we've got on the order of a quarter of projects that are either canceled outright, that is, they never deliver working functionality, or they're just considered by the businesses to be unsuccessful. And the reasons for this are somewhat complicated. I think what we have is a combination of what I would think of as actual inefficiencies and perceived inefficiencies. There is no question that the average project could be run better. And part of this, a large part of this, I believe, is because the skills to run the project successfully are really just not there. And we see that the average developer reads less than one professional book per year and subscribes to no professional journals after school. That is, after the college education is completed, if that was ever completed in the first place. Most education on the part of typical developers is ad hoc, reading from blogs and news groups, if that. And the education that occurs from that is correspondingly spotty based on what a person happens to stumble onto on their blogs and news groups, and based on the highly varying level of quality of the information that is presented on blogs and news groups. So I think there are definitely some actual inefficiencies. At the same time, I think that some of those inefficiencies are more perceived than actual. Clearly, in the early days of a project, stakeholders tend to form expectations, and those expectations tend to be unrealistic and unachievable. And as an industry, technical staff and technical leadership staff tend to be pretty ineffective at overcoming those unrealistic and unachievable stakeholder expectations. And we at Construx have certainly worked with many companies over the years, and in many of those instances been highly successful in adjusting stakeholder expectations, but that really is not the state of the practice. The state of the practice is that those unrealistic expectations are allowed to persist. Beyond that, I think many projects are managed at an intuitive or logical level, and in software there are certain things that are intuitive and logical, but there are a lot of things that really are not intuitive and logical, and so some of these quote logical management and customer actions that are really intended to improve project performance actually end up undermining project performance unintentionally. So we really have a mix of actual and perceived inefficiencies. Another interesting aspect of the state of the practice is you would tend to think intuitively, this goes back to that idea that intuition is not always right here, that if we look at a distribution of project outcomes on a scale of effectiveness, that we would have something like your typical bell curve, where we've got a bunch of projects that are essentially average, and then some on the far right that are much better than average in their effectiveness, and some at the far left that are much worse than average in their effectiveness. And while this is a very natural, logical assumption, this is not how project effectiveness is distributed in the wild in the software industry. The real distribution looks more like this, where we have actually quite a skewed distribution, where what we find is that the average practice is actually pretty close to the worst practice, and the best practice is significantly better. So much better that we actually may find in some quarters people disbelieving that such effective practices could even be possible or even work. And so this is an interesting part of the state of the practice, is a very asymmetric distribution of project effectivenesses. I think another important aspect of the state of the practice is that few organizations understand what it really takes to scale projects. And I think a very shorthand way of describing this would be to point out that if we have a really small project, the activity that I've called software construction, that is coding and debugging, low-level design and unit testing, would make up something like 2/3 of the effort on a well-run project. Whereas when we get to very large projects, those same activities are actually only going to make up 1/3 of the effort. And so what we typically see is companies that succeed on small projects, and then they try to scale up to larger projects by simply multiplying all the activities on the small project proportionately, And that just doesn't work, because we don't just need more of every activity on a larger project. We also need different kinds of activities or different proportions of activities. And I think that that's not well understood. And we lived through that dynamic in the 90s, and I think with the move to Agile, we're really living through that dynamic again as companies succeed in the small with their Agile projects, but then struggle as those projects become larger. And often I think companies will misdiagnose the problems they encounter on larger projects as problems related to statements like Agile doesn't scale, when really the issue is just that they're essentially ignoring the challenges of what it really does take to scale, which sometimes has a little bit to do with Agile, but often really has to do with a different set of issues related not to Agile or non-Agile, but just related to the issues involved in larger projects. The final comment I'll make about the state of the practice is that we really, in some ways, have not seen a whole lot of change over the last 30 years or so. If we look at the history of software development, we can see that back in the 1980s, the focus really was on structured methods. That's what people were talking about. In the 90s, the focus really was on object-oriented methods, and that's what people were talking about. And in the 2000s, people have really been talking about Agile methods, and in particular, Scrum, with an increased focus lately on Lean and Kanban. So that's what the focus has been. But what we really saw is that on the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, teams were giving lip service to these methods, and what really was happening is that all along, teams have mostly been using code and fix. And so I think in some part, the state of the practice, it's almost as though the labels have changed over the last 30 years, but the practice in many ways has changed very little. And so earlier this year, for example, we were talking to a company that was talking about the fact that it had moved towards Scrum and had a Scrum implementation, and they said, yes, we have moved towards Scrum, however, we found some of the practices really couldn't be implemented in our organization, and so we have mainly implemented daily stand-up meetings, and we hold those on Fridays. And this is actually an extreme case in terms of the lack of fidelity of the implementation in Scrum. But the idea that companies do exceedingly partial implementations of Agile methods today, or object-oriented methods in the 90s, or structured methods in the 80s, that really has been a constant for many, many years. And so the state of the practice, I think, the state of the literature has certainly changed. The state of what pundits talk about has changed, but the state of the practice has evolved in very, very small steps. And because of all this, because of more disappointing outcomes than we would expect, because the average state of the average practice is so much closer to the worst than to the best, and because teams often give more lip service to leading methods than actual implementation of leading methods, that allows me to make a bold claim about the business case for better software practices. And that claim is that improved software practices are businesses' last great frontier. In other words, the last great opportunity to receive massive return on investment from the investment in better software practices. And just to give you an example of what some of the returns that have been documented are, with a handful of selected practices, by no means an exhaustive list, what we've seen is that with test-driven development, we can demonstrate ROIs over a 3-year period of about 1,000%. With personal software process, team software process, that is PSP, TSP, 3-year ROI of about 800%. Formal inspections, which have been well understood since the late 1970s, we can get an immediate 12-month ROI of about 250% with a 3-year ROI on the order of 600% or more. And you can see the other details on the slide, but we have really massive gains to be had from productivity measurement, process assessments, Scrum, management training, staff training, process improvement programs, lots and lots of potential here. And the amazing thing here is that in many business contexts, when businesses are deciding where to make investments, they will have discussions that go something like this, where they say, Well, if we need to retool our manufacturing plant, and the cost of capital to retool the manufacturing plant is 5%, and we can get a return on that of 15%, that will be actually a very good return, and so that's a good use of our capital, and we will go ahead and invest in retooling our plant because we can get a 15% return. And in a lot of businesses, a 15, 20, 25% return would be an outstanding return on investment. There just aren't that many business investments that offer a return as high as 25%. And yet, when we look at this chart, we see that the returns listed are many times what would typically be the highest return available. We have returns in these several hundreds of percents. And so this claim that improved software practices are business's last great frontier is not just an overstated hyperbole. It is literally an amazing opportunity that many businesses have taken advantage of, but that far too few still have actually taken that step. So to give you some examples of businesses that have taken these steps, these are all numbers that have been reported on return on investments in improved software practices. We've got Boeing Space Transport System reporting an ROI of 775%, BDN an ROI of 300%, GTE an ROI of almost 700%, Hewlett-Packard SESD an ROI of 900%. And as you can see, there are other data points that are not ROIs per se that are listed in white rather than yellow, but other organizations have also reported dramatic improvements that you could certainly infer an ROI from those improvements. Other examples, IBM Global Software reported an ROI of 550%. Motorola GED reported an ROI of well over 600%. Philips, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon all reported ROIs of in the 400 to 700% range. Thomson CSF reported an ROI of about 400%, as did the U.S. Navy. United States Air Force Ogden Air Logistics Center reported an ROI of close to 2,000%, and a couple of other United States Air Force organizations reported ROIs on the order of 600%. And so you can see it's not just one or two data points. It's actually numerous data points that show really staggeringly high ROIs. And when you put all this information together, the general pattern that we see is that improved software practices pay an average ROI of about 500%. And that includes false starts, and that means that includes trying things that don't actually work. And so the investment, including the stuff that works and the stuff that doesn't work, gives businesses an average ROI of about 500%. And the improvements are sustainable for many years. So this isn't just a one-shot effort where we go in, make some changes, and then we're done. This is something where we can actually sustain investments and improvements and ongoing ROIs over a period of many years. And this has actually been well known for a long time. That is well known in certain circles, but certainly not as widely practiced as we might wish. Now, given these very large numbers, staggering numbers really in some sense, it would certainly be fair to ask the question, especially if we are skeptical, technical people by nature, are these numbers really too good to be true? Well, part of the answer to that is clearly with this many data points, it's hard to argue that these are too good to be true because so many companies have independently reported similar results. But the underlying reason, I think, also helps to explain why these numbers really aren't too good to be true. What we see, if we look at the life cycle cost profile of a typical project, is that the typical organization makes little to no investment in requirements. This is shown by the red line. Little to no investment in architecture, little to no investment in detailed design, and then expends much of their project cost on construction, with really the highest amount of costs going into testing and debugging. And in contrast, a more, what I will call advanced project or healthy project, invests somewhat more in requirements. And as you can see from the yellow line, it's not massively more. It's roughly double, but it's double on a very small base, and roughly double the work in our architecture, but again, on a very small base, and then somewhat more than double in detailed design. But what we get in exchange is dramatically lower construction costs and even more dramatically lower testing and debugging costs. And so what we'll see in the Healthy project is that the extra investment in the upstream activities of the project, as shown by the shaded green area, that would be the extra amount, the shaded green area, is a relatively small investment compared to the disproportionate savings shown by the shaded orange area on the right side of the graph. And this dynamic is true whether we're talking about a phased sequential waterfallish approach, which is kind of what's implied by the way I've drawn the graph here with lines, but really these can be thought of as activities just as easily as they can be thought of as phases. And even if we're on a highly iterative project, if we're using Scrum or Kanban, we still have to do requirements work, we still have to do architecture work, we still have to do detailed design, construction, testing, and debugging. We may not be as aware of those as separate activities because of the iterative nature of the work, but we are in fact still performing those activities, and the basic dynamic applies either way. That if we minimize investment in these upstream activities of requirements and architecture, then we pay for it in spades downstream. And that is where the cost savings comes from in these typical ROI numbers, is simply whether we're in a Scrum context or whether we're in a stage gate context or some other context, making sure that we are doing a little bit extra requirements work, a little bit extra architecture work, and so on. Another way to look at the savings is that on a typical project, about 40% of the effort goes into planned work and 60% goes into rework, most of which is unplanned. On a better run project, we can never drive rework to zero. That's not realistic, but we can certainly drive rework to a much smaller number. And so by increasing somewhat the planned work, we can get a disproportionate reduction in the unplanned work. And overall, the overall project cost ends up being lower. And so what we found in the organizations that have looked at this or have embarked in these kinds of practices, that we've got some very significant benefits from this. We get basically improved cost, quality, and schedule all at the same time, mainly through focusing on improved quality. And we've seen typically that improved software practices can reduce costs an average of about 35% per year, but that's by no means the best case. The best organizations have sustained cost reductions on the order of 55% per year and have sustained those for many, many years. And we have seen anecdotal examples of that at my company as recently as this year for companies that have really focused on where are the costs going, improving their practices, and getting very dramatic cost reductions as a result. We see better predictability. This chart is from a set of U.S. Air Force projects and shows the improvement in predictability over time as a result of the focus on improved software practices. And as we can see, by the time this organization got out to the far right, they had a really excellent level of predictability, certainly compared to where they started, which is shown by the wide scatter of points on the far left. We've also seen improved cycle time. That typical organization has been able to shorten its schedules by an average of 15 to 20% per year. Again, this is sustainable over a period of many years, so those improvements can compound over a period of years. We also see improved quality. And I think it's important to understand that poor quality is the single largest cost driver for most projects. So sometimes people think that in terms of the famous iron triangle, that quality is one of the areas that we can trade off. That's really not the case, because poor quality is typically already the thing that's costing us the most. And so when organizations try to reduce cost or shorten schedules by further shortchanging quality, really what they're typically doing is actually making a bad problem worse and extending their schedules and increasing their costs. And so by focusing on improving quality, the typical software organization has been able to improve an average of about 40% per year, meaning reducing its defect rates by about 40% per year. And again, this is not the best case. The best case is more like 70% per year and sustainable over a period of many years. We also see, as organizations have moved to more iterative development, that their success rate has tended to increase. So-called traditional projects have a rate of being challenged or failing that is on the order of 50%. whereas more iterative projects have a success rate that exceeds 60% and is more like 70%. And so this is another area where focus on better practices can actually improve, of course, the details of improved cost, schedule, and quality, but also the ultimate success rate of the project. So I think one thing that tends to be absent from the numbers that are reported for ROI is the ROI numbers tend to be based on operational efficiency, that is, reduced cost. But I think part of what's missing is that as we get our software house in order and we improve predictability and improve quality, we open up new opportunities to our business because we have more predictability and quality in our projects, and as a result, we are in a better position to make commitments to our customers, make commitments to the marketplace, take strategic gambles and that kind of thing, which we really are not in a position to do when we're really just struggling to keep our heads above water, which is what many organizations out there are doing. So I think overall we have lots and lots of benefits that we can talk about here. And I think because the benefits are so extreme, and I think the evidence is quite compelling on these, it would be fair to ask, why isn't every company seizing this opportunity? And first I have to say clearly, some companies are seizing the opportunity because all this data comes from somewhere, and so there certainly are some companies that have seized the opportunity and have demonstrated these kinds of results. I think one reason that companies don't seize the opportunity is this chart. It's chart. I said chart, but it's not really a chart. Is this notion that is stated as a joke? Hard work often pays off over time, but laziness often pays off now. And I think that actually is the attitude in a lot of software businesses, and in particular, if your business is in a high growth mode where you're actually busy cranking out software, where you are busy making lots of money, it's really hard to justify slacking off from that to focus more on improved practices when you're basically cranking out products that are making a lot of money. And why would you stop doing that when that's really what your business is supposed to be doing? And I think the answer is that that only goes so far. And a lot of times businesses will be in that mode for a while, but of course what they do during that period is accumulate mountains of technical debt. And as the businesses become more mature and once the gold rush starts to subside, then they are left with the need to better understand how do we improve the way we go about doing software. And honestly, that's typically when the organizations start to come talk to my company, is when they are no longer making money hand over fist, and they can't quite figure out why are our projects not going as well as they used to go, and then we get to talk about some of the ways that the practices can be improved. I think that another reason that businesses don't seize the opportunity is complacency that arises from small project success. And as we saw, we can be very successful on small projects really through just sort of sweat and determination and hard work. That really doesn't work as we scale up to larger projects, and so many companies' first response as they scale up projects and as those larger projects are less successful than the smaller projects is they try to do the same thing that made them successful on smaller projects more or harder or with higher fidelity. And the problem is those are all very intuitive and natural responses, but the problem is those strategies don't work because what's needed is different kinds of activities at larger scales. I think another reason companies don't seize the opportunity is the field of software development has been advancing quite rapidly over the years, and I think that for people who have been in the field for a long time, there's often a lack of appreciation of how advanced the software field has become. People still think things like, well, we just need to hire smart people and they'll figure out how to do good requirements work, for example. And the problem is that we've had, or the reason that analysis isn't really right, is that we have had very smart people focusing on requirements, for example, for about 50 years now, and those smart people have moved the ball quite far down the field in terms of sophistication of requirements practices, and so we actually are many years past the point where even a really smart individual could figure out all those good requirements practices purely on their own. We have accumulated a significant body of knowledge in the field of software engineering, And a lot of companies don't really understand how significant that body of knowledge is. And in particular, many companies that develop software are not primarily software companies. They may be computer hardware companies or medical device companies or retail companies or other kinds of companies that put a lot of money into their software projects but that are not primarily software companies. And often the executives in those companies may have ideas about software development based from their time in school in the 70s or 80s maybe, and those ideas at this point in time are very out of date in terms of the level of sophistication that can be brought to bear on making software projects successful. Finally, I think another reason that companies don't seize this opportunity is because of this dynamic that the average practice is so close to the worst practice. You know, it's very possible that any individual could work for 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years and could work for several companies over the course of a career, but always stay on the big fat part of this curve on the left and never actually experience software development performed really well in the relatively small percentage of companies that are way off to the right, that are very highly effective. And so people very naturally think, oh, I've been to work at 5 different companies and it's about the same everywhere. And based on their experience, that is certainly makes sense that they would feel that way, but that's really just based on the fact that the average in the industry is so much closer to the worst than to the best. And so we need to pry people loose from these expectations based on past experience with past practices that really in many cases have limited effectiveness, and get people moved to practices that really can be much more highly effective and that have been used by a good number of companies. A small percentage, but a pretty big number when you look at the raw numbers. And so this brings us to what I would propose as a strategy for realizing these gains from improved software practices. And I want to say that I believe this strategy should be focused on staff capability. If we go back to the Agile Manifesto, one of the values in the Agile Manifesto was to favor individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And in my view, this is one of the great unmet promises of the Agile movement, because what we have seen is typically that in the Agile practices, what we still mainly have is a switch to different processes and tools, a switch to Scrum, a switch to Kanban, a switch to Lean, none of which are really focused on the people, but are really which are focused on defining a different process. These processes and practices and tools may indeed be more effective. In many cases they are. They may, by implication, be somewhat more humane, and I think in many cases they are. But what they really are not is they really are not an explicit focus on individuals and interactions. And I think achieving this objective really requires a focus on enhanced staff capability. That is, on making the people who are doing the work more effective and more competent, more highly competent. And I think if we focus on really highly competent individuals, then the processes still matter, but the processes become secondary if we have really, really capable staff. And so one way I like to look at this kind of issue is through the lens of Kokomo 2 cost drivers. Kokomo 2 is the best known estimation approach out there. I have reservations about its use for estimation specifically, but I have to say that I believe that the statistical work that's been done in the context of Kokomo 2 to isolate the effects of different influences on software project outcomes is probably the most rigorous statistical analysis that's been done in the software industry to date. And this slide shows 21 cost factors in Kokomo that can have either the effect of reducing total effort and cost or increasing total effort and cost, as shown by the lengths of the bars and the numbers on the sides of the bars. And I'm not going to talk about all of these factors in this presentation today, but I want to point out a couple of different things that are implied by the Kokomo data. One is that if we just look at which of these factors are personnel related, we find things like requirements analyst capability. How good are the people doing the requirements? Programmer capability. How good are the people writing the code? personnel continuity. How high or low is your staff turnover in your organization? Business area experience, language and tools experience, platform experience, and finally team cohesion. How well do people on the team get along? That collectively we can either decrease effort by 78% from nominal if we do well on all these factors, or we can increase effort 373% above nominal if we do poorly on all these factors. And the collective impact here is a 17x total difference in productivity due to the cumulative impact of these personnel factors. In other words, if you have a project that performs the worst on just these personnel factors versus a project that performs the best on all these factors, that project that performs the worst will take 17 times as much total effort as the project that performs the best. And realize we're not talking about processes here. We're really talking about the human capabilities of the individuals on these projects. Now, another way to look at the COCOMO data, which I think is also instructive, taking a different view, is really the view of what degrees of freedom do you have in actually manipulating these different cost factors. And this chart shows you in the gray bars those factors that I believe are largely uncontrollable in most organizations. That is, if you look at the top factor, product complexity, that is typically handed to you by the nature of the business you're in. You're not going to be able to change that factor without getting out of that business and getting into a different business. Same thing for the fourth factor on the list, execution time constraint. How fast does your code have to operate? Well, again, there, if you're working on embedded real-time systems, you're not going to change the fact that you have execution time constraints without getting into a different line of business. And so these gray factors, I think, really are just basically constants, given the particular business that any company happens to be in. Now, the red factors, and there are only 3 of them, are factors that are typically within the control of an individual project manager. So the extent of documentation required would often be within the manager's control. How actively the project attacks architecture and architecture issues and risks, and the focus of the project for reuse. Those would typically be under the project manager's control. And then the rest of the factors, the factors shown by yellow bars, are typically not under the control of the project manager, but really are controlled by the organization. And so things like requirements analyst capability. Typically, the individual project manager takes who is available in whatever state of development they happen to be in when the project gets underway, and doesn't have a huge amount of ability to influence that. Maybe they can send people to training on a just-in-time basis, but the idea that the organization has developed great capability and requirements is really something that the organization has to work on. Likewise, with programmer capability, typically the organization is what hires from the top end of the talent pool or the bottom end or the middle, and an individual manager doesn't have a lot of influence over who they get on their project. It's really going to be based on who already works in the organization, and for that matter, who the organization can attract and who the organization is able to retain. And this is really a key point, because in typical organizations, when an organization focuses on improvement, the responsibility for that improvement is often pushed down to the individual manager level. And yet the individual manager often really doesn't have much leverage to make meaningful improvements if we look at those COCOMO cost drivers. The best leverage for improved software practices really does come into play at the organizational level. And so, if at all possible, we really like to work, at my company, we like to work at the organizational level to try to improve the organization's capabilities. And of course, we're always happy to work with individual managers or contributors, but the highest leverage really is at the organizational level, and so if we can get work at that level, we love to do that. So I think understanding the nature of the investment is also really important. And what we've found as an industry over the years is that if organizations are willing to make more significant investments, they are able to receive disproportionately higher returns. And of course, there are a variety of ways that we could build staff capability. We could certainly build that through experience, and there's no doubt in my mind anyway that experience is the best teacher, but the lessons are costly and they take a long time, so that can be a slow way to improve. Mentoring can be another good option. I think it's a great option if qualified mentors are available who already have the skills that the organization wants to develop, and if there are enough of those mentors, and if those mentors are actually have the time to provide mentoring. And those are all big question marks in many organizations. A lot of times the people you want providing the mentoring are already on the critical path of other work and just aren't that available. And so this is one of the reasons that my company has been providing training for the last 17 years, is that training often can be the fastest, most scalable option. And in contexts where we don't have time to learn from experience, and maybe we don't have enough available mentors, training really can be a very good option. And what we've seen in the industry is that a company that is willing to invest on the order of 2% of its fully burdened labor costs, focused on direct costs of training and coaching, that would typically work out to something like $2,000 to $3,000 per year per staff member, typically can access the kinds of ROIs that we've been talking about in this talk, the ROIs that are on the order of 500% or even higher. And interestingly enough, multiple studies have found that higher levels of investment produce disproportionately higher levels of return. And I think the reason behind that is that fragmented investment, where we just say, well, let's try this one class, because other project pressures don't go away. There's a statement that says one of the worst sins in training is to send a changed person back into an unchanged organization. And I think with small amounts of investment, that's what we get. We send a changed person back into an unchanged or unreceptive or even hostile organization, and then it's difficult to make progress. So again, if we can get involved at the organizational level, that really tends to work out the best. Where to start? I think the studies over the years, I've been in the software industry for almost 30 years now, and the basic, certainly the best practices have changed a lot, but the challenges really haven't changed that much. And so we still see biggest challenges coming from requirements and product planning. We see certainly we can start with initial Scrum implementation, which is often a good place to start. Estimation and planning is often another pain point for organizations. Sometimes for organizations that are a little bit further down the road, getting more sophisticated in their quality assurance is the place to start. At this point in history, since many companies have tried Scrum, we find a good place to start is often restarting stalled or ineffective Scrum implementations, where companies can see the promise of Scrum, but their specific implementation is not producing the benefits they believe they should be able to get from it. And then certainly as organizations and projects scale, supporting projects at scale and helping out organizations understand what's really different as we get to bigger projects. What do we need to do differently? That's another typical starting point. Of course, the specifics vary greatly depending on the nature of the organization, and our company's focus, Construx's focus, really is on identifying the best focus areas for organizations and then supporting the successful improvements that allow companies to access these exceedingly high returns on investment through effective deployment of better software practices. A final thought that I'll leave you with today in the context of improved practices is this Chinese proverb, which is that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. And with that, I will go ahead and turn the mic over to Andy and see if we have any questions.
Steve, thank you so much. It won't surprise you to learn that we do have questions. We always have a lot of questions with Steve's presentation. So just a reminder to everybody, if you do have any questions, please type them into the chat window. We will get to as many as we can over the remaining 12-13 minutes. Steve, I'm going to start with a nice, easy one for you. And I'm sure you could probably speak for another 45 minutes on this one. But question came in from Pam. The ROI on these practices seems to be so high. Why do you think it is that companies don't understand the message, or at least don't seem to accept and embrace the message?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because obviously I did try to address that question during the presentation, but I do think that it is a variety of reasons depending on kind of where the company is. And so, you know, I think just disbelief that things could be any better is part of it, and I think that preoccupation with what's happening now is part of it, there's this very nice phrase, the tyranny of the urgent, and it really refers to the fact that we tend to be focused on what's urgent rather than what's important. And I think improved practices fall into that category. They're important, but if we're busy making money, they aren't really urgent. And so, I think we definitely want to be careful that we don't embark on our pursuit of better practices in a way that undermines our current business objectives. That would be a very bad idea. And I think sometimes companies are concerned about that. But, we've been doing this for a long time now, and we believe that it's definitely possible to pursue better practices while keeping the engine running on the current project. And so really I think it's interesting. What we've seen over the years is that industries tend to move into new practice areas, not in lockstep, but really in response. There's a first mover in the industry who moves in. Other companies start to see the improved capability that first company gets, and then other companies in that industry will follow. And this does seem to happen within the industries because companies will compare themselves to other companies in the same industry, but they won't really be that aware of what practices are being used in different industries. And then staff also kind of moves across different companies. But technical workers, there's not an ironclad rule by any means, but technical workers, when they change jobs, often will stay in the same basic industry. And so they will sort of cross-pollinate different companies as they move around, and so the practices all just kind of level up as people move around and as individual companies try it. But it's interesting because you can have whole industries that have embraced certain practices that are very effective, and then other industries that are completely ignorant to those same practices just because no one has happened to make the first move. So, a variety of reasons, and obviously the point of giving this talk really is to try to raise awareness of just how much potential there is.
It always amazes me in this competitive environment that we all find ourselves in organizations where you have to try and differentiate from your competitors, that these changes do seem to happen on an industry-by-industry basis rather than one innovative company stepping aside and saying, hey, I can make myself look better here. Amazing.
Earlier at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned one of the 7 questions was, do you know what your productivity is? And one of the things I've observed over the years is that the leading companies in any industry really don't care what their competitors' productivity is, because their mission is to make themselves better. If they're the best, they need to get better. If they're the worst, they still need to get better. And so, it's not about how you are relative to your competition. It's about how you are relative to yourself, and it's about improving that. And that's where a lot of these improvements come from.
Fair point. And actually, it's a nice segue into another question that came in from David. And he's referencing one of the slides where you noted that 50% of projects are successful. And that data, I think, is about 5 years old now. So he was asking whether or not with the penetration, the greater usage of Agile with Scrum or other Agile methods, do you think that 50%'s improved? Are organizations getting better at this, or is there still sort of a ceiling to break through there?
Yeah. Well, the reason I'm laughing is the assumption in that question is with greater penetration of Scrum and Agile.
Yeah.
And we have to separate what the window dressing is from what the actual practice is. And so, if we had the ability to go in and assess project teams that are faithfully implementing Scrum, I believe from what we've seen with our clients that the success rate is extremely likely to be higher with those companies that are really doing faithful Scrum implementations. However, most of the companies that say they're doing Scrum are not really doing Scrum. They are basically putting a different label on a set of not very sophisticated practices that is not a whole lot different from the practices they were using when they put the waterfall label on those practices or whatever other label they put on them in the past. And so for us to see any difference in the rate of project success, we would have to see a difference in the percent of organizations that actually are adopting practices effectively and not just changing the labels. And I think that's really what we haven't seen over the years, is we really haven't seen a whole lot of difference in the effectiveness. And I would say for my company's consulting practice, we probably see more companies than not now that say that they're using Scrum. I would say probably significantly more than half that say that they're using Scrum. But when we ask them, what practices are you using, the variety of responses is pretty amazing. You know, they'll say, we're using Scrum, and we'll say, oh, well, what specific Scrum practices are you using? And they'll say, oh, well, we're doing a little bit of pair programming, and we're doing pretty consistent continuous integration. And they don't even realize those aren't even Scrum practices, but that's their notion of what Scrum is. And that's not an unusual case by any means. And so I think very typically an organization that says it's implementing Scrum will be doing daily stand-ups and sort of doing a kind of sort of release maybe on a monthly basis, but they're not really bringing the release to a potentially releasable level of quality. They don't have any real notion of a time box where they make a hard commitment and deliver whatever was committed. You know, so they're doing a couple of the practices, but you know, they're just not doing enough to really get the benefits.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. Somebody said to me a little while ago, you can't do Agile, you have to be Agile, and I think that's where a lot of organizations are still falling down. They think they can just sort of pay that lip service to it.
You know, our view of Scrum is that I think Scrum is already a pretty minimal process, and so if you try to take things away from Scrum, I think you really are risking the effectiveness of the process. And so Scrum is an interesting case. I would not say this about very many practices, but I think Scrum is a case, you know, normally you talk about the 80-20 rule, where you do 20% of the work and you get 80% of the benefit. And just based on anecdotally what we have seen, I would say Scrum's almost the opposite. You could do almost 80% of Scrum and get 20% of the benefit. Because it's so minimal in the first place, you really have to do pretty much all of Scrum to access the full benefits. I think sometimes companies will do 25 or 50% of Scrum and they'll get some benefit, and the benefit they get will feel good, but they just don't realize how much they're leaving on the table by not doing a fuller implementation.
Yep. There's quite a few questions around measurement and what the best metric is to try and determine success, and a lot of people are asking about whether or not it's functional points and hoping that you're not going to suggest lines of code. And you know, what do you think is the best way to actually measure whether or not we are being effective as organizations?
Yeah, so that's really kind of brings up the entire topic of measurement, which obviously is a bigger topic than even a 1-hour presentation.
Yeah.
I don't think there is one best way to measure success or one best way to measure the size of the thing that we're building. I think it behooves organizations to spend some time defining what success looks like for them so that they can recognize it when they see it, and so that they have something to aspire to. You know, I think a lot of times the definition ends up being kind of sloppy, and that's probably okay, as long as you've talked about it and have a good organizational understanding of what you mean by it. You know, when we talk about very detailed measurements like function points or lines of code, there is a large sense in which those really are kind of navel-gazing metrics, and they might kind of sort of be meaningful at a project level in some circumstances, but they really are so specific, and they have so many asterisks attached and so many elements of interpretation attached to them that you really have to know what you're doing on those measures for them to be meaningful at all. And when all the dust settles, it's unclear what you really get, even if you have all the expertise applied to them. So I think a lot of times cruder measures, but that are more specific to the organization, can actually be a lot more meaningful, even if it's something like count of marketing requirements or count of engineering requirements. We've got a couple clients that as their size measure count pages of requirements, if you can believe that. And in those contexts, it's actually an effective measure, but due to some very specific aspects of their environments.
That's reading pages of requirements. That's a new one on me. We've got just a couple of minutes left. I'll try and get one more question in. A lot of people are asking specifically around situations that their organizations face and whether or not you have any advice for typical challenges. But I think this question that came in from Andy, and with a name like that, it must be a smart question, it says, my management really needs to hear this message. Are you available to do executive briefings? Are you able to sort of guide and coach organizations on how to adopt that.
Yes, of course. That's that's a big part of what my company does, is work with other companies to adopt better practices, and getting upper management on board can often be a really important piece of that puzzle. So, yeah, this is a presentation that has been given to upper management audiences, and we're very happy to work with companies to figure out, how do you go about approaching your upper management? What are the right messages? And I think one of the big things in talking to upper management is, what are you asking for? Because upper management usually wants to do something, and when you go talk to them, you need to be clear ahead of time. What are you asking them to do? And so making sure that you figured that out and have a good basis for why you're asking them for what you're asking them for, all that stuff matters. So yeah, we would love to hear from anybody who is interested in having this presentation presented privately, or through webinar or other means, and love to help these companies out.
Excellent, thank you, and your contact details are on the screen for everyone to see. I wish we had another hour. There's still a huge number of questions that we haven't had a chance to get to. We will make sure that Steve sees all those. In the meantime, thank you everybody for attending today. Steve, thank you so much for your time, and I hope we talk to everyone again soon in the next Projects at Work webinar. Thanks everyone, have a great day.